Passing is king in the NFL, and nothing disrupts that passing game quite like a dominant edge rusher. Von Miller came over to the Rams midway through last season. He helped them get past the favorite Tampa Bay on their way to a Super Bowl win. Oh wait, you might say. Miller only had a solitary sack against Tom Brady in that game. However, sacks are not the best way to evaluate edge rushers, a topic that we're going to dive into in this episode. With these freak edge rushers, we must also look at the offensive line and its ability to protect. Just like with wide receivers and cornerbacks, we're going to look for symmetry in the metrics. But it's a little bit more complicated for pass blockers. Let me explain. Get the quarterback. That is the main job of edge rushers. As Tom Brady once said, these defensive guys are like, quote, dogs chasing cars, end quote. With this mandate, it makes most sense to look at sacks. But we don't want to just look at the total number of sacks that an edge rusher gets. We want an efficiency metric. And with PFF data, we can actually count up the number of pass rush snaps that any defender has. So we're going to look at sack rate, or sacks divided by pass rush snaps for a defender. Since we're in the preseason, we're going to look at how predictive last year's sack rate is in predicting the upcoming season. To look at this, we're going to look at the correlation between these quantities from year to year. If the correlation between year to year is high, we're going to say that this quantity is predictive or that it's sticky. And if it's low, then this quantity is going to lack predictability. If you're a math person, this probably all makes a ton of sense to you. If this seems foreign to you and the notion of an R-squared value is somewhat foreign to you, I have a visual explanation of regression and all these concepts that I'm going to be talking about on the site. To get there, you can use the URL thepowerrank.us. That is a URL that'll take you to a place on my site that has a visual explanation of regression. Let's look at players classified as edge rushers by PFF. And let's look at the correlation from year to year of sack rate. The R-squared value is 0.025. So that is very small. That means only about 2.5% of the variance of a defender's sack rate one year is predicted by what happened the previous year. That's not good. Randomness plays a big role in sack rate. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to expand the number of events that we're looking at to classify these edge rushers or these defenders that are putting pressure on the quarterback. Instead of just looking at sacks, let's look at other plays in which the defensive player is making the quarterback's life miserable. Luckily, PFF tracks a number of other plays. One of those is QB hits. So this is whenever a defender actually makes contact with the quarterback. And then they also track hurries. So this is any play in which a defensive player is going to get into the vicinity of a quarterback and make him throw the ball. In the data, the sum of sacks plus hits plus hurries are pressures. So now we can talk about pressure rate, which is simply the number of pressures divided by pass rush snaps. We're going to, again, look from year to year at the correlation of pressure rate. In my data set, the first pair of years that I look at is 2018 to 2019. And then my data set ends with the last two seasons, 2020 and 2021. I'm asking that a player has at least 80 pass rush snaps in each season. And I'm looking at 309 players. Now, when you look at the correlation from season to season, the R-square value is 0.14. So about 14% of the variance for a pressure rate for a defensive player is explained by what happened last season. That's not the most predictive that I've ever found. To put this in perspective, I've done some analysis on quarterback completion rate, and there I found an R-square value of 0.28. So 28% of the variance from one year explains what happens in the next season. However, there is other evidence to support the usefulness of pressure rate for defensive players. So that R-squared of .14 was for players classified as edge rushers within the PFF system. I also looked at what happened for interior linemen. There, when you look at the correlation of pressure rate from season to season, you get an R-squared of .34. So here, 34% of the variance from this season is going to predict what happens next season. It's much stickier. I also did some work on pressure rate in season. This looked at all pass rushers. I did not distinguish between edge rushers and interior linemen or linebackers. I did this last season, and I split the data up into the first part of the season, which was the first 9 weeks, and then the rest of the season. I had about 179 players in this data set, and there I actually found a really large R-squared value. It was .39, so 39% of the variance of the later part of the season was explained by what happened in those first 9 weeks. That seems a little bit flukishly high, but it still suggests that pressure rate for a defensive player is predictive. But here is the take-home message for defensive players. Instead of sack rate, which looks at a limited number of events, we want to look at pressure rate. A pressure is going to be the sum of sacks plus hits plus hurries, and where the rate is simply the number of pressures divided by pass rush snaps. The concept here is similar to some work that I've done with quarterbacks and interceptions. For the quarterback, I found that interception rate from year to year wasn't that predictive. Interceptions are a very limited set of events, and what I found was that I needed to expand the number of events that I looked at. So instead of just looking at interceptions, I decided to look at interceptions plus passes defended. These are all the plays in which a defensive player gets his hand on the ball and breaks up the play. So instead of just picks, now I was looking at bad balls, which is the sum of picks plus passes defended. And when you look at bad ball rate, the predictability for quarterbacks went way up. Now, this is the same thing for pass rushers. Sacks is a very limited set of events. We need to expand that set of events, so we look at the number of pressures. That's sacks plus hits plus hurries, and we're getting a much more predictive statistic. Let's look at some examples. When I was putting this outline together for this podcast, I wanted to talk about that game between the Rams versus the Bucs. From watching that game last January, I remember Von Miller had a big day against Tom Brady. However, when I looked it up, Miller had 1 sack. But again, sacks don't tell the entire story. Von Miller had 9 hurries. 9. He harassed Tom Brady all day long. Of course, Miller's job was made a lot easier because Bucs offensive tackle Tristan Wirfs did not play in that game due to injury. That obviously made his life a lot easier. Over the course of last season, both in Denver and in Los Angeles, Miller had a pressure rate of 15.2%. This is significantly better than the 10.3% NFL average for players classified as edge rushers. Von Miller is off to Buffalo, and he's certainly a reason that the Bills are Super Bowl favorites this preseason. As another example, let's look at a few of the top sack leaders from last season. And first, let's consider Robert Quinn. In 2021, he set a Bears single-game season record with 18 sacks. This was only behind the 23 sacks of T.J. Watt of the Steelers. However, pressure rate tells a much different story for Quinn. He had a pressure rate of 11.7%, which is pretty close to the NFL average of 10.3% for edge rushers. He had a very good year last year, like he was certainly above NFL average, but he had a really good year in terms of converting all those times that he got close to a quarterback into a sack. However, this isn't necessarily a repeatable skill for edge rushers, and Quinn had the exact opposite in 2020, 2 years ago. That season, he only had 2 sacks. Now, his pressure rate was worse than last year. It was 8.8%, so he was below the NFL average. That's certainly not as good as last year, but it doesn't justify only having 2 sacks in that year. So what we're seeing is that Robert Quinn had some good fortune in 2021 and some bad fortune in 2020. Overall, he's pretty average NFL pass rusher, and you can see that from his pressure rate. T.J. Watt is not an average NFL pass rusher. He had a 14.9% pressure rate last season. This is excellent. However, I do want to point out that that's not as good as what Von Miller did last year. Miller was at 15.2%, but Miller logged fewer sacks than Watt. Watt had the highest sack rate of his career last year, and we're simply going to have to expect regression. You can't expect that TJ Watt's going to get another 23 sacks this season, no matter how dominant he is on the football field. So we've talked about pressure rate as a way to classify defensive players. How does this compare with PFF grades? PFF tracks every single play of every single NFL game. They have 2 people that watch it, and these 2 people assign every player on the field a grade. And this is what goes into their PFF grading system, which is something that I use to evaluate players. So let's look at what the grades say, or let's look at the stickiness of the grades from season to season. For edge rushers, the R-squared value is 0.30. This means that 30% of the variance in the current season in PFF grades is explained by what happened last season. This is a tremendous R-squared value. That means pass rush grades are very predictive for edge rushers. Remember, we had an R-square value of 0.14 for pressure rate. However, we see a different story for interior defensive linemen. For the grades of defensive interior linemen, the R-square value is 0.045. So less than 5% of the variance of a season in terms of PFF grades is explained by what happened last season. That's not very sticky at all. And remember, defensive interior linemen had a really high stickiness or pressure rate, 0.34. So among the different position groups, we're not seeing PFF grades being more predictable than pressure rate or vice versa. However, it's a different story on offense. Let's dig into that. To protect against pass rushers, you need to have a strong offensive line. And to evaluate these pass blockers, we can actually look at the symmetric statistic. We're going to look at pressure rate allowed for offensive linemen. Again, it's the same definition. A pressure is simply the sacks plus hits plus hurries that an offensive lineman allows. So let's look at some averages amongst the different position groups. Centers allow 3.2% pressure rate, and that goes up with the guards. They allow a 4.8% pressure rate. This is data over the last 4 seasons. And tackles allow the highest pressure rate, 5.6%. And this makes sense because they're facing the most dangerous edge rushers on the outside. Let's look at the predictability of pressure rate amongst those various offensive line groups. So when you look at pressure rate allowed and the correlation from season to season for tackles, the R-square value is 0.11. So about 11% of the variance one season is explained by what happened the previous season. Again, that's not great. And this 11% is actually the highest amongst those 3 position groups. The R-square values for guards and centers are less than that. Now, it's not like we want to throw out pressure rate as a statistic for offensive linemen. Randomness is always going to impact the game of football due to small sample size, and maybe we should just be happy that we have this data from PFF. But let's check in on PFF grades. Again, this is where PFF has 2 people assigning a grade to each player on the field for every play in every NFL game. And now we're seeing much higher predictability. For example, the R-squared value for tackles is 0.31. So now 31% of the variance of PFF grades one season is predicted by what happened the previous season. We're seeing much more predictability in PFF grades across all three offensive line groups. So why is this? Well, quarterbacks own a huge part of the pressure rate. This is something that I first learned from research done by Dr. Eric Eager over at PFF. And I've certainly found the same thing when I look at the PFF data over the last 4 years for the pressure rate of quarterbacks. I'm seeing some high stickiness as well. PFF tracks the number of dropbacks for every quarterback and also the number of pressures that the defense generates. So the pressure rate is simply the number of pressures generated by the defense divided by the number of dropbacks. Season to season, the R-squared value here is 0.22, so 22% of the variance in pressure rate for quarterbacks is explained by what happened last season. And this is just a significantly higher value than what we saw for linemen. Remember, the value for pressure rate allowed for tackles was 0.11. This supports previous work. My sample size is a little bit small because I only looked at the last 4 seasons, and so that was about 100 different quarterback pairs of seasons. Dr. Eager has done some work previously. I couldn't find the reference, but he did find an R-square value of 0.33 for pressure rates for quarterbacks, so even higher. So the conclusion here is that quarterbacks seem to own that pressure rate. And this really impacts how we should evaluate offensive linemen. Like, we're going to rely more on PFF grades than pressure rate allowed because the PFF grades are more predictable. So let's look at some examples. First, consider Chukwuma Okorafor. He's a tackle for the Pittsburgh Steelers. He's entering his 5th year out of Western Michigan. His pressure rate allowed has been fantastic the last 2 seasons. It was 3.8% in 2020, 3.2% in 2021, and this is significantly better than the NFL average of 5.6% for tackles. The Steelers rewarded him with a 3-year, $29 million deal. However, let's be cautious about these statistics. Okorafor protected Ben Roethlisberger over the last 2 years. And for all the faults of Big Ben late in his career, and there were many, he was really good at getting rid of the ball. When you look at the pressure rate that defenses got on him, he was fantastic. He had the lowest pressure rate in 2020, and he was second behind only Tom Brady last season. Big Ben had a big role in Okorafor's stellar pressure rate allowed. And when we consult PFF grades, we see a different story. Okorafor had grades of 62 and 61 the past 2 seasons, and that's significantly less than the average PFF grade of about 67 for tackles. Ben Roethlisberger is now in retirement. I don't expect Okorafor's pressure rate to stay so low. He's an example of when you want to rely more heavily on PFF grades to look at pass blocking. As another example, consider Mark Glowinski. He's an offensive guard that has played with the Colts since the 2018 season. And in 2020, he allowed a 4.7% pressure rate. And this is right in average with the NFL average for guards. In 2021, this ballooned to 8%, his pressure rate allowed. And a clear factor here was the quarterback. In 2020, he protected Phillip Rivers, who was excellent at getting rid of the ball and not allowing a huge pressure rate. He was second behind only Ben Roethlisberger when you look at pressure rate allowed amongst starting quarterbacks. Then in 2021, he got Carson Wentz. And this is a quarterback that is not as good at getting rid of the ball and is known for taking sacks. Again, the quarterback owns the pressure rate. In terms of PFF grades, Glowinski was much more consistent over those 2 seasons. He had a grade of 67 in 2020, not quite as good at 63 in 2021, but in both seasons, he was better than the average of about 60 for NFL offensive guards. Glowinski signed a 3-year, $20 million deal with the Giants, and he should be an above-average asset for the G-Men. The Giants are most likely going to start Daniel Jones at quarterback this season. In 2020, he was very bad at pressure rate allowed. He got closer to the NFL average in 2021 before he got hurt. Passing is king in the NFL, and the pass rush has an obvious impact on the outcome of games. When we look at pass rushers, it's really important to go beyond sacks and look at pressures. Pressures is the sum of sacks plus hits plus hurries. For offensive linemen, we can look at pressure rate allowed. However, this isn't as predictive for offensive linemen because quarterbacks tend to own that pressure rate. For offensive linemen, PFF grades are more predictive. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Football Analytics Show. My name is Ed Fang, and I'm honored that you made it to the end of this episode. If you enjoyed this episode, please check out my free sports betting email newsletter. This is a free service in which I write about football bets that I make, and I strive to be 3 things. 1, valuable. 2, concise. 3, entertaining. Smarter sports betting in under 5 minutes. If you sign up for this free service, I'll send you my top 5 sports betting podcast episodes. This is the ultimate educational resource for your ears. To get this free service, go to thepowerrank.com. That is my site for better sports betting through predictive analytics. Once again, that's thepowerrank.com. Thanks again for listening, and I will talk to you again soon.